Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a deep dive into a story so wild you might struggle to believe it. Imagine a massive city, not on land, but floating on the surface of a lake. Yep, you heard that right. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, was built right in the middle of a lake, completely surrounded by water. Before we go any further, take a second to appreciate how bizarre and brilliant that sounds. It's like saying, let's build a metropolis on the ocean. Only the Aztecs did it and made it work. Pretty crazy, huh? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with where you're tuning in from and the time of night where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now imagine the scene. You're standing in the center of what could be the most advanced city in the world at that time, and it's floating on Lake Texcoco. The water shimmers under the sun as huge pyramids rise above you. These pyramids were more than just impressive buildings. They were symbols of power and devotion. But what's wild is the city was far from just a place of grandeur. It was a place of survival, strategy, and brilliance. The Aztecs had to work with the environment, harnessing the water and the land in ways no one had ever imagined before. They didn't just settle on an island in a lake because it was pretty. It was the perfect defensive move. They could control access to their city, keeping enemies at bay while allowing them to thrive. The water surrounding Tenochtitlan wasn't just decorative, it was functional. The Aztecs used canals as transportation routes. Picture this. It's like a gigantic version of Venice, but with a whole lot more purpose. The canals weren't just there for aesthetics. They were the highways of the city, helping people get from one floating district to another. And what's even crazier is that they didn't just stop at building a city. They created something that worked in harmony with the water, floating gardens. Yeah, you heard me right, floating gardens. If you think about it, it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, right? But these gardens were a total game changer for the Aztecs. Now, you might be wondering how on earth these gardens were created. How does one build a garden that floats on water? Well, it wasn't magic. It was ingenuity. The Aztecs created a structure using reed mats that were placed on the lake, creating stable platforms that could support plant life. They piled dirt on top of these mats, creating soil where crops could grow. In a place where arable land was scarce, this was a masterstroke. It was like building an entire farm on the water, making full use of every square inch of their environment. These floating gardens weren't just for show, either. They played a crucial role in the daily life of Tenochtitlan. They provided food for the people and the military. But it wasn't just about practicality. They were also symbols of Aztec engineering and their deep connection to nature. The Aztecs saw the act of farming as more than just a means of survival. It was an offering to the gods, a sacred act. And while we're on the subject of the gods, let's pause and consider this. These gardens weren't only designed to nourish people. They were meant to nourish the gods as well. These intricate gardens, with their vibrant flowers and crops, were a visual representation of the Aztecs' reverence for nature and the divine. But here's the twist. Despite all their brilliance, the Aztecs weren't impervious to challenges. The lakes that gave them so much life could also be their downfall. As we dive deeper into the story of Tenochtitlan, we'll explore not just the triumphs, but the inevitable difficulties that arose when nature and human innovation collided. The city was a marvel, but it wasn't perfect. We're about to embark on a journey through time, where the Aztecs used the environment to their advantage, while also fighting to survive in a world where nature could easily turn against them. What's even more fascinating is that historians are still debating how exactly the Aztecs managed to make these floating gardens work so seamlessly. Some argue it was a perfect system that allowed for food security. Others think it was a little more complicated. Either way, what's clear is that the Aztecs weren't just surviving. They were thriving in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. And while their city may have fallen, the legacy of their innovation, those magnificent floating gardens, continues to capture our imagination to this day. The Aztecs built something timeless, something that continues to intrigue us centuries later. So, as we venture forward, let's keep in mind that the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan weren't just a feat of architecture. They were a statement, an embodiment of the Aztecs' mastery over nature, their ingenuity, and their drive to conquer the odds. And in the next sections, we'll see how these floating wonders played a pivotal role in the everyday life of the Aztec people, from food production to religious ceremonies and even military strategy. As the sun sets over the ancient city, let's step into the heart of Tenochtitlan, where water, life, and innovation came together in a delicate dance of survival. As the sun begins to set over the vast lake, the light shimmers across the water, and you get a sense of how the Aztecs saw their city, a true marvel built on the water, defying the natural order. You know, it's a little like setting up a massive garden in the middle of a pool at your house, but on a scale that's almost impossible to imagine. The floating gardens, known as Chinampas, were a stroke of genius that made Tenochtitlan not only an awe-inspiring city, but also an agricultural powerhouse. It's almost as if they built a garden on the water because they had figured out something no one else had: the best way to grow food in a world where land was scarce. The process of creating a Chinampa was quite the task. Imagine this. You're standing on a boat, navigating through the canals that snake through the city, and you're getting ready to build a floating garden. You start by harvesting reeds from the lake, particularly the ahujote reed, which grows abundantly around the edges of Lake Texcoco. These reeds were then woven into large mats that would serve as the base of the garden. The mats weren't just for decoration. They formed the foundation for everything. You'd think that creating a garden on water would be impossible, but the Aztecs knew exactly what they were doing. These mats were like huge platforms floating on the surface of the lake, and they were anchored to the lake bed using wooden stakes, a technique that kept them stable and fixed in place. The entire thing was like a giant raft with soil carefully piled on top to grow plants. But here's where it gets even more amazing. These mats weren't just laid down flat. They were designed to absorb water and maintain moisture, which made them incredibly efficient for growing crops. Picture this. The water beneath the floating garden acted like a natural irrigation system, nourishing the plants in ways that even modern gardeners would envy. It's like combining the world's best garden and the world's best irrigation system into one. The plants on these floating gardens thrived, thanks to the constant water supply and the fertile soil that came from the lake itself. They were growing food at a speed and scale that would make any urban gardener jealous. The Aztecs weren't just growing corn and beans on their floating gardens. Oh no, they were cultivating a variety of crops, including squash, tomatoes, and even flowers used for religious purposes. The beauty of the Chinampas wasn't just that they were functional. They were an integral part of the Aztec way of life. Each garden was a small ecosystem in its own right. These floating plots helped to feed not only the people of Tenochtitlan, but also the army and the priests who needed a steady supply of food for their rituals. The food wasn't just for survival. It was a way to honor the gods, an offering made from the earth and the water. But even as the Aztecs perfected the system, they faced challenges. The Chinampas had to be maintained constantly. Over time, they could become overgrown or be damaged by heavy rains, and it was crucial to constantly repair them. Imagine living in a city where you're not only growing food, but also maintaining a floating garden every day. Sounds like a full-time job, right? In fact, it was the Aztecs employed teams of workers to take care of the floating gardens, ensuring that they stayed intact and productive. They also had a system of crop rotation to maintain the fertility of the soil, a practice that modern-day farmers still use to this day. What makes this system so remarkable is how sustainable it was. The floating gardens weren't just about feeding the population for the moment. They were a long-term solution to agricultural challenges. In fact, they were designed to keep producing food over the long haul, providing a steady supply year after year. The Aztecs had figured out how to harness the power of nature, turning the water into an ally rather than an obstacle. It's almost as if the Aztecs were the first environmentalists, understanding how to live in harmony with their surroundings in a way that many modern societies are still trying to figure out today. And then there's the fact that this system wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving. The Aztecs had built an entire city that wasn't just a place to live, but a place to grow, to worship, to create, and to innovate. The floating gardens were not merely a reflection of their agricultural prowess. They were a symbol of their dominance over the forces of nature. The lakes that surrounded Tenochtitlan, once seen as a barrier, had been transformed into an asset, allowing the Aztecs to create an environment where food, culture, and spirituality could flourish together. The gardens, growing right on the water, serve as a constant reminder that this civilization wasn't just surviving. It was thriving, adapting, and dominating the world around it. But what's truly fascinating is that even with all this innovation, the history of the Chinampas remains somewhat of a mystery. Despite all the archaeological evidence, historians and researchers still debate how exactly the Aztecs were able to make these gardens work with such precision. Some believe it was simply a matter of trial and error, while others argue that the knowledge was passed down from earlier civilizations. Either way, what's clear is that the floating gardens were a significant achievement that was years, if not centuries, ahead of their time. So, while we can marvel at the sheer ingenuity behind the Chinampas, the fact remains that these floating gardens were not just a marvel of design. They were a testament to the way the Aztecs viewed the world. They understood nature and its cycles in ways that many modern societies are still trying to comprehend. They knew that to survive, they had to work with nature, not against it. And in that, they created a legacy that would leave its mark on the world for generations to come. Now, let's settle into a more intimate view of the floating gardens, these miraculous creations that were so much more than just agricultural systems. They weren't just vital to the Aztec way of life, they were at the heart of it. Imagine the bustling life around the canals of Tenochtitlan. Every day, people would move from one floating garden to the next, paddling along in their canoes, carefully tending to their crops, or perhaps trading goods with their neighbors. These gardens were like the arteries of the city, flowing with life, food, and commerce. It wasn't just about food production, it was about how the food was woven into the very fabric of Aztec society. Picture yourself waking up in the morning, surrounded by the rich scents of blooming flowers and ripening corn. The floating gardens were not just places to grow food, they were also cultural hubs. You might stroll through the verdant rows of plants, the soft rustling of the water beneath you as you move. Maybe you're stopping to pick some beans or squash for breakfast. But beyond the food, there's something deeper. These gardens were a constant reminder of the symbiotic relationship the Aztecs had with their land and water. You can almost feel the quiet connection they had with nature, a connection that infused their everyday life, making something as simple as gathering vegetables a spiritual act. These floating gardens were also a hub for trade. If you were a merchant in Tenochtitlan, the Chinampas were the perfect place to set up shop. Imagine a bustling market scene where people are paddling along the canals, stopping to buy fresh produce directly from the gardens. You would hear the sounds of bargaining echoing over the water, vendors shouting out their wares. Everything from tomatoes to avocados to the exotic flowers that were used for religious ceremonies. It's almost like a farmer's market, but multiplied by 100 and floating on water. Food was not just for survival. It was deeply embedded in Aztec culture. The floating gardens supplied an array of crops that were used for daily meals, but they also had a sacred role. Many of the plants grown on these gardens had spiritual significance. Corn, for example, wasn't just the staple of their diet. It was considered a gift from the gods. You might even see people offering portions of their crops as part of religious rituals. They believed that by offering the fruits of their labor, they could ensure the continued favor of the gods, who were thought to be responsible for maintaining balance in the world. This deep intertwining of religion, nature, and daily life made the floating gardens not just a place of physical sustenance, but of spiritual nourishment as well. And then, of course, there were the canals, the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan. While the floating gardens were a marvel of agricultural engineering, the canals were a feat of water management and urban design. You could easily picture yourself paddling through these canals, the water flowing smoothly around your canoe. These canals weren't just a means of transportation. They were designed to maintain the health of the floating gardens themselves. They acted as irrigation systems, ensuring that the crops remained hydrated, but they also served another crucial purpose: defense. By surrounding the city with water, the Aztecs made it nearly impossible for enemies to approach without being detected. They weren't just farming on water. They were using it as a protective barrier, keeping their city safe from invaders. But let's not forget the darker side of life on the water. Life on these floating gardens wasn't all peaceful trading and crop harvesting. The canals could be dangerous. Flooding was a constant threat, especially during the rainy season, when the water levels could rise quickly, submerging parts of the floating gardens. The Aztecs had to be vigilant. They had to ensure that their gardens were properly maintained and that the canals were regularly cleared of debris to prevent blockages. This maintenance work wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. Imagine the constant work it took to maintain these floating systems. Not just the physical labor of planting and harvesting, but the effort to ensure everything stayed afloat and functional. As we reflect on this, it's clear that the floating gardens were more than just agricultural tools. They were a symbol of the resilience of the Aztec people. The city of Tenochtitlan, with its floating gardens and intricate canals, was a perfect example of how the Aztecs had mastered their environment. They had created a self-sustaining system that worked with the land and water rather than against them. It wasn't just about surviving in an unforgiving landscape. It was about thriving. But there's something even more fascinating about these gardens. The Chinampas were also a statement of the Aztecs' ability to adapt and innovate. They had managed to take a natural environment that many would consider inhospitable and turn it into something that supported a vast, growing city. They weren't just building gardens. They were creating an entire ecosystem, one that provided food, trade, defense, and spiritual significance all in one. These floating gardens were not merely a way to grow food. They were a testament to the Aztecs' ingenuity, adaptability, and understanding of the world around them. Historians and archaeologists continue to marvel at these floating gardens. Some still debate the full extent of their agricultural impact, while others are in awe of the complex relationships between the water, the land, and the people who lived in Tenochtitlan. What is clear, however, is that the Chinampas were not just an agricultural innovation. They were a defining feature of Aztec culture, and they continue to capture the imagination of anyone who learns about them. Underscore as the canals wind through the heart of Tenochtitlan. Their purpose becomes clear, not just for transport or beauty, but as the very veins of an intricate hydraulic system that connected the people of the city to the land, the water, and each other. You see, the floating gardens weren't just a stroke of agricultural genius. They were a product of equally impressive hydraulic engineering. The Aztecs' ability to manage water, control its flow, and harness it for both agriculture and defense was unparalleled at the time. The design of Tenochtitlan's canals and floating gardens wasn't just practical. It was a marvel of engineering, balancing water management with urban planning in a way that modern cities are still trying to replicate. The canals were meticulously constructed to manage the flow of water throughout the city. They were more than just waterways. They were designed to regulate the water levels and ensure the city remained buoyant and functional. You could think of them as ancient plumbing systems built to divert and control the water in a way that maximized the benefits for both the city and the gardens. The Aztecs carefully adjusted the water levels throughout the year, depending on seasonal rains. They had a deep understanding of the cycles of nature, and they used this knowledge to create a city that wasn't just surviving, but thriving. At the heart of this hydraulic system were the Chinampas themselves. These floating gardens were far from simple rafts. They were purposefully engineered to float on the water, with a base made of intertwined reeds that acted like a natural sponge, absorbing and retaining water. Over time, these floating platforms became more solid, as they were reinforced with layers of earth, and they developed into permanent agricultural plots. The soil used in the Chinampas came from the lake bed itself, dredged up by the Aztecs as they expanded their city. This process, known as artisanal dredging, created a fertile mixture that was ideal for farming. What's even more impressive is how the Aztecs used the water surrounding the floating gardens to regulate the temperature and moisture levels. The cool water from the lake provided natural irrigation, while the raised soil beds allowed for better air circulation around the plants. This design kept the crops hydrated but not overly saturated, preventing root rot, a problem that many gardeners today are still trying to avoid. It was a perfect balance of nature and human ingenuity. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate just how advanced this was. At a time when much of the world was still relying on primitive farming techniques, the Aztecs were creating an ecosystem that was not only self-sustaining, but capable of supporting a population of over 200,000 people. They understood the delicate relationship between the earth, the water, and the sky, and they had the skills to manipulate those elements to their advantage. To think that such a city, thriving on a lake, was able to support so many people for so long is nothing short of miraculous. And it wasn't just the Chinampas that benefited from this engineering. The entire city of Tenochtitlan was built with water management in mind. The canals were part of a broader system that ensured the city was connected, protected, and supplied with water. The Aztecs had developed a complex series of dams, sluices, and aqueducts that regulated the flow of water into the city and prevented flooding. These hydraulic systems worked together to ensure that water was always available for drinking, for farming, and for defense. It was, in essence, an ancient water supply system that had a profound impact on the city's survival and growth. However, maintaining this system wasn't easy. Flooding, especially during the rainy season, was a constant threat. The Aztecs had to be vigilant, ensuring that the canals were cleared of debris and that the water levels were carefully monitored. They even built a series of channels that allowed them to drain excess water when the rains came, preventing the Chinampas from becoming submerged. The work involved in maintaining these canals was never-ending, but it was essential for the health of the city. Without this attention to detail and foresight, the floating gardens and Tenochtitlan itself would not have survived. Here's where the genius of the Aztecs really comes into play. The canals weren't just for growing food or controlling water. They were also part of the city's defense system. Imagine being an invader, trying to approach the city. You wouldn't just have to deal with the Aztec warriors defending the causeways. No, you'd have to navigate through a maze of canals, each one a potential obstacle to your progress. And because the city was built on water, it was incredibly difficult for enemies to lay siege to it. The Aztecs used the natural landscape to their advantage, turning what could have been a disadvantage into a strategic asset. In addition to all this, the water systems also provided a platform for trade and communication. The canals allowed goods to be moved efficiently throughout the city, facilitating the flow of resources and information. Can you imagine being a merchant, paddling your canoe from one floating garden to the next, exchanging goods, and learning the latest news from around the city? The canals weren't just practical. They were the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan's economy, allowing the city to function smoothly. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Chinampas and the canals is how they reflected the Aztec worldview. The Aztecs saw themselves as stewards of the earth, and their relationship with nature was based on respect and reciprocity. They understood that in order to thrive, they had to work with the forces of nature, not against them. This belief was reflected in the design of Tenochtitlan, where the city structure was built to integrate harmoniously with its environment. The floating gardens were a perfect embodiment of this philosophy, blending agriculture, water, and spirituality in a way that was completely unique. And even today, historians and archaeologists are still fascinated by the sophistication of this system. The Chinampas are often cited as one of the most advanced agricultural systems ever created, and while much of the technology has been lost, it's clear that the Aztecs were far ahead of their time. The engineering behind the floating gardens was a testament to the ingenuity, resilience, and deep connection the Aztecs had with their environment. It's a system that continues to captivate us, even centuries later, and it's a reminder that when humans work with nature rather than against it, extraordinary things can happen. As you glide through the canals of Tenochtitlan, surrounded by the lush greenery of the Chinampas, you can't help but feel the bustling life around you. These floating gardens weren't just quiet places of agriculture. They were at the heart of the city's economic and spiritual life. They served as vibrant hubs where food, goods, and ideas flowed freely, connecting the Aztecs not only to each other, but to their gods as well. These Chinampas weren't just farms. They were marketplaces, temples, and symbols of the Aztec way of life, blending agriculture, trade, and religion into a harmonious whole. Imagine yourself in the middle of this incredible city. As you paddle your canoe down one of the canals, you pass by bustling floating markets, where traders from all corners of the empire come to exchange goods. The floating gardens, with their rich crops and abundance, were not only providing for the people, but were actively involved in the complex web of trade that kept the city alive. People would come to these markets not only to buy food, but also to trade rare and valuable items like precious stones, textiles, and even cocoa beans, used by the Aztecs as currency. It's easy to picture the vibrant energy of the scene. As merchants haggle over prices, boats drift by laden with produce, and the scent of fresh flowers, fruit, and herbs fills the air. The Chinampas weren't just a means to produce food. They were a strategic point of trade. The Aztecs were experts in the art of commerce, and the floating gardens provided a constant supply of fresh goods to trade with other cities and regions. These gardens were essentially an agricultural factory, churning out products that were traded not just for food, but for luxury items, religious artifacts, and even materials to build the city's infrastructure. In a place where access to arable land was limited, the floating gardens were a critical lifeline. And what's even more amazing is how the canals themselves helped facilitate this trade. The ability to move goods quickly and efficiently between different parts of the city made Tenochtitlan a thriving hub of commerce. But the Chinampas weren't just places of economic exchange. They were also deeply tied to Aztec religious practices. Food and agriculture played an important role in Aztec rituals, and the Chinampas were integral to these spiritual practices. Many of the crops grown on the floating gardens weren't just for everyday consumption. They were offerings to the gods. Corn, beans, and squashes were considered sacred foods, and many of the most important rituals and ceremonies of the Aztec calendar revolve around these crops. You can almost feel the solemn atmosphere as priests, clad in ceremonial garb, make their way to the floating gardens to harvest the sacred crops for offerings. For the Aztecs, the act of cultivating and harvesting was as much a religious duty as it was an agricultural task. Each crop grown on these gardens was a tribute to the gods, a way to keep the universe in balance. The relationship between the Aztecs and their gods was deeply rooted in agriculture. The gods were believed to control the forces of nature, and the fertility of the land was directly tied to their favor. The Aztecs had elaborate rituals to ensure that the gods would continue to bless their crops and provide for their people. The floating gardens were central to these rituals. As you imagine the scenes unfolding on the water, you can almost hear the chants of the priests, feel the rhythmic beating of drums, and see the offerings placed upon the altar: corn, flowers, and the harvest of the Chinampas. This wasn't just about food. It was about maintaining a spiritual balance between the people and the divine. The floating gardens were sacred spaces, not just for growing crops, but for ensuring the survival and prosperity of the entire city. It's fascinating how the Aztecs saw no distinction between the secular and the sacred in their everyday lives. For them, the act of planting a seed, tending to a garden, and offering that produced to the gods wasn't just a part of their daily routine. It was a deeply spiritual experience. It's almost as if they understood that agriculture wasn't just a means to feed the body. It was a way to feed the soul, to nourish both the people and the gods. But while the Chinampas served as the spiritual backbone of Tenochtitlan, they were also essential to the functioning of the military. In the same way that they acted as hubs for trade, they also became crucial to the defense of the city. Imagine this. The canals that were used for peaceful commerce and farming could just as easily be turned into defensive fortifications. The Aztecs were masters of strategy, and their ability to use the canals and Chinampas as part of their defensive system was a stroke of brilliance. The water acted as a natural moat, making it incredibly difficult for enemies to breach the city without being detected. The Chinampas were strategically placed along the edges of the canals, providing an almost impenetrable layer of defense that made Tenochtitlan virtually untouchable from the outside. But despite all the power and wealth these floating gardens brought to Tenochtitlan, they weren't without their challenges. The canals were not only paths for trade and defense, they also presented constant maintenance issues. The Aztecs had to constantly dredge the canals, clear debris, and ensure that the water level remained stable. Heavy rains could easily flood the Chinampas or, conversely, leave them parched during dry spells. It was a delicate balance, and the people of Tenochtitlan worked tirelessly to maintain it. In fact, the very existence of the Chinampas relied on this constant upkeep. The floating gardens were built on reed mats that had to be regularly replaced or reinforced to keep them afloat. If the mats broke down or the soil became too compacted, the gardens could sink, rendering them useless. This meant that the people who tended the gardens weren't just farmers. They were also engineers, working to maintain the delicate balance between land, water, and sky. The ingenuity and labor that went into maintaining the Chinampas was part of what made Tenochtitlan such a remarkable city. As we look at these floating gardens from a historical perspective, it's clear that they were more than just an agricultural system. They were a symbol of everything that made the Aztecs so extraordinary. They represented the blending of nature and human ingenuity, the connection between the mundane and the divine, and the perfect marriage of agriculture, trade, and defense. The Chinampas were a testament to the Aztecs' ability to shape their environment to suit their needs, creating a system that was not only functional but sustainable. And though the world may have moved on from the days of Tenochtitlan, the legacy of the floating gardens continues to captivate our imaginations, offering us a glimpse into a civilization that was centuries ahead of its time. As we glide further into the depths of Tenochtitlan, the city reveals more of its secrets, especially its ingenious use of water as a natural defense mechanism. While the floating gardens were marvels of agriculture and trade, they were also part of a much larger, strategically designed defense system. If you've ever watched a movie where the hero fights their way through a labyrinth or maze to get to the treasure, you might get a sense of how the Aztecs used their cities' canals and floating gardens for their own defense. Tenochtitlan wasn't just surrounded by water. It was a fortress built on water, where every canal, every garden, and every causeway played a role in protecting the city from invasion. Imagine standing on one of the elevated causeways leading into Tenochtitlan, looking out over the canals that stretch like veins through the city. The sight is almost hypnotic. The glistening water reflects the bright blue sky above, and yet, under that calm surface lies the perfect trap. The water surrounding the city made it almost impossible for invaders to approach without being detected. Every boat that attempted to enter the canals would have to pass through a series of checkpoints and be scrutinized by the warriors guarding the city. The canals weren't just paths of transportation. They were the lifeblood of the city's defense system. Think of them like a moat, but with a complexity that made it nearly impossible for any invading force to breach the city without considerable effort. The Aztecs were masters at using water as both a barrier and a weapon. The canals, in many ways, acted as choke points, forcing anyone who tried to get through them to slow down and deal with the city's defenders. Tenochtitlan's military forces, well versed in the use of their environment, would use the canals to their advantage. In the event of a siege, the Aztecs could quickly flood sections of the canals or drain them, making it even more difficult for enemy forces to maneuver. It was a system that ensured that the people of Tenochtitlan could not only survive an invasion, they could potentially defeat one. Now, imagine that you are one of the Aztec warriors stationed along one of the causeways or by the canals, watching for any signs of approaching enemies. The water around you gives you an almost eerie sense of control. It's not just about defense. It's about using the environment to outsmart your opponents. The causeways, which are the only land routes into the city, were narrow and easily defensible. But what made these causeways so effective was that the Aztecs could flood or block the canals to create an additional barrier for anyone trying to cross them. If an invading force made its way across the water, they'd find themselves in unfamiliar terrain, often trapped between the water and the Aztec warriors. It's almost like the Aztecs had created an intricate labyrinth of water and earth that only they could navigate efficiently. But beyond the immediate defense of the city, The canals also played a vital role in maintaining the flow of goods and people during times of war. While the floating gardens were primarily for food production, they also served as an essential component of the city's supply chain during military conflict. The Aztecs could move supplies, soldiers, and weapons quickly and efficiently through the canals. In times of war, these waterways became vital supply lines, allowing the Aztec military to transport their forces and resources without worrying about land-based obstacles. You might picture boats gliding through the city at night, carrying everything from food to warriors to the tools necessary for the defense of the city. The canals weren't just lifelines for trade. They were strategic assets that allowed Tenochtitlan to thrive in an era of constant warfare. The role of water in defense didn't stop at the canals. Tenochtitlan's position on Lake Texcoco was itself a powerful strategic asset. The lake was expansive and difficult to navigate, meaning that anyone trying to approach the city from the water would have to deal with the natural geography of the region. The Aztecs, however, made sure that their access points were fortified. The city was built on a series of islands, each one connected by narrow causeways that were easily guarded. These causeways were equipped with bridges that could be raised or lowered, allowing the Aztecs to control who entered and exited the city. Imagine an enemy force trying to march across one of these causeways. If they were intercepted, they'd find themselves cut off from retreat, surrounded by water and the city's defenders. However, it wasn't just the physical barriers that made Tenochtitlan such an effective fortress. The very design of the city, with its canals and floating gardens, made it incredibly difficult for an invading force to fully comprehend the layout of the city. The Aztecs created a labyrinth of water and land that was both beautiful and functional, confusing for outsiders and easy for those who knew it well. To navigate the city, enemies would have to deal with a combination of waterways, bridges, and causeways, making it incredibly challenging to move through the city without being exposed. This isn't to say that Tenochtitlan was completely invincible. As history shows, no city, no matter how well defended, can remain unconquered forever. But the fact that Tenochtitlan stood as an independent and thriving city for so long, despite numerous attempts at conquest, speaks volumes about the brilliance of its design. The Aztecs' ability to use their environment to their advantage, particularly the water, was a key factor in their ability to protect and sustain their city for centuries. As we look back at the fall of Tenochtitlan, one thing remains clear. The water that once acted as the city's greatest strength also became its vulnerability. The Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, would eventually overcome the city's defenses. But the use of water as a defensive weapon, as well as the clever tactics used by the Aztecs, showed how far ahead of their time they truly were. The canals, the floating gardens, and the city's design were all part of a larger vision. A vision where nature and human ingenuity came together to create something extraordinary. And while Tenochtitlan may have fallen, its legacy as one of the most strategically and architecturally advanced cities of its time remains undeniable. Underscore as we continue our journey through Tenochtitlan, you may begin to wonder, while the floating gardens were a marvel of engineering, surely they weren't without their challenges. After all, when you're building an entire agricultural system on water, things are bound to get complicated. While the Chinampas were a perfect solution to the city's food supply issues, they required constant attention, maintenance, and fine-tuning to stay functional. The Aztecs faced challenges with their floating gardens that required the same level of ingenuity and determination they had used to create them in the first place. Maintaining these floating ecosystems wasn't easy, and it demanded both physical labor and sophisticated knowledge of the environment. First, let's talk about the physical upkeep. These floating gardens weren't static, they were living, growing systems that needed constant attention. The Chinampas were built on mats of reeds, and over time, those mats could wear out or degrade. The Aztecs had to regularly replace the reed mats, ensuring that the base of the garden remained buoyant and stable. If the mats sank too much, the garden would become submerged in the lake, and all the crops would be lost. Imagine the work involved. Workers on boats would navigate the canals to retrieve new reeds, replace the old ones, and weave the mats back together. It was a labor-intensive process, but one that was necessary for the success of the gardens. The soil on the floating gardens also needed constant attention. The Aztecs used a technique called horizontal dredging, where they would dig up soil from the lake bed to create a fertile mixture for planting. This soil was incredibly rich in nutrients, thanks to the minerals in the lake. However, over time, the soil would become compacted and less effective at supporting plant growth. So, in addition to replacing the reed mats, the Aztecs had to periodically refresh the soil by adding new layers of dredged material. It was a delicate balance. Too much soil, and the garden might become too heavy to float, too little, and the crops wouldn't have enough nutrients to thrive. But somehow, the Aztecs managed to get it right year after year. Another challenge came with the rise and fall of the water levels in Lake Texcoco. During the rainy season, the lake would swell and the canals would flood. This could drown the floating gardens, making it difficult to grow crops. On the other hand, during the dry season, the lake level could drop, leaving the gardens parched. The Aztecs had to be vigilant about managing the water levels in their canals to prevent flooding or drought from damaging their crops. They used sluices and drainage channels to control the flow of water, ensuring that the Chinampas received the right amount of water to thrive. The canals had to be cleaned regularly to avoid blockages, and the water needed to be carefully controlled to avoid both flooding and dehydration. The rains, while crucial for growing crops, could also create massive problems. Heavy rainfall often led to soil erosion, and if the Chinampas were not carefully maintained, they could erode and lose their ability to float. The Aztecs had to be constantly on the lookout for signs of soil erosion and make repairs whenever necessary. It's easy to imagine how this could have been a constant source of frustration. Rain could both nourish and destroy, and the people of Tenochtitlan had to stay ahead of the weather, always ready to take action before the flooding or erosion damaged their precious floating gardens. Then there were the pests and weeds. The same water that nourished the crops also provided a perfect environment for unwanted plants and animals. Weeds could overrun the gardens, suffocating the crops and making it harder to grow food. The Aztecs had to carefully manage their gardens to ensure that the crops had enough space to grow and that the weeds didn't take over. Similarly, pests like insects and rodents could threaten the crops. While we may think of these challenges as modern gardening problems, they were just as real for the Aztecs, who had to find natural ways to deal with these issues. They likely used organic pest control methods, such as planting certain crops to repel insects or using natural predators to keep pests in check. What's truly impressive is how the Aztecs were able to overcome all of these challenges. Their understanding of the natural world and their ability to adapt to it were key to the success of the Chinampas. They didn't just create a floating farm. They created a sustainable system that could produce food for an entire city despite the difficulties they faced. They were masters of water management, agricultural techniques, and environmental stewardship, using their knowledge to keep the gardens thriving in the face of constant challenges. The Chinampas were in essence, a microcosm of the Aztec approach to life, an intricate system that required constant care, attention, and innovation. The gardens weren't just a symbol of agricultural success. They were a testament to the Aztecs' ingenuity and resourcefulness. These challenges, far from defeating the floating gardens, only highlighted the extraordinary effort the Aztecs put into maintaining them. Their dedication to preserving the Chinampas ensured that Tenochtitlan could feed its people and remain a thriving metropolis, even in the face of obstacles. But of course, no system is perfect, and the Chinampas weren't immune to problems. As history tells us, the Aztecs eventually fell to the Spanish conquistadors, and Tenochtitlan was destroyed. The floating gardens, once symbols of the city's ingenuity, were abandoned. Over time, the canals were filled in, and the Chinampas became little more than a memory. Yet, the legacy of these floating gardens lives on, and their story continues to inspire awe and admiration. Today, historians and archaeologists continue to study the Chinampas to understand the full extent of their engineering and agricultural brilliance. What the Aztecs achieved with such limited resources is still a point of fascination, and the floating gardens remain one of the most remarkable achievements of pre-Columbian civilization. Underscore as we float deeper into the heart of Tenochtitlan. The floating gardens take on a new layer of meaning, one that goes beyond their practical use as an agricultural marvel. The Chinampas were more than just a means of growing food or trading goods. They were a reflection of the Aztec worldview and their profound connection to nature, spirituality, and the gods. These gardens weren't just fertile plots of land. They were sacred spaces designed not only to nourish the body, but to honor the divine forces that governed life. For the Aztecs, the act of farming wasn't just about survival. It was an act of devotion. The gods, especially the agricultural deities, were seen as the providers of life, and it was through the cultivation of crops that the people showed their gratitude. The floating gardens were places where the earth and the divine met. Corn, beans, squash. These were not just staple foods. They were sacred offerings to the gods. Imagine a priest walking through the gardens, his ceremonial staff in hand, preparing to harvest the crops that would later be offered during religious rituals. These gardens were not only functional but spiritually potent, connecting the Aztecs with their deities in a way that few other agricultural systems could. The central role of the Chinampas in Aztec religion can be seen in the way they were integrated into the city's larger religious practices. Tenochtitlan itself was a sacred city built to reflect the cosmos. The city was divided into different districts, each representing various aspects of the Aztec belief system, and the floating gardens were woven into this sacred landscape. In many ways, the Chinampas were a microcosm of the larger world, the natural world, the human world, and the divine world, all in balance with one another. To the Aztecs, everything in the universe was interconnected, and the floating gardens were a symbol of that interconnectedness. The importance of the Chinampas in religious ceremonies can be seen in the crops they produced. Corn was perhaps the most sacred of all the crops. It was a gift from the gods, and it held deep spiritual significance. The Aztecs believed that humans were made from corn, and so they offered the gods the very food that sustained them. During the harvest season, entire ceremonies were dedicated to the corn gods, and the floating gardens played a central role in these rites. Crops grown in the Chinampas were carefully selected and offered as sacrifices, not just for sustenance, but as a way to maintain the balance between the natural and spiritual realms. You can imagine the rituals that took place on these sacred floating gardens, where priests and commoners alike gathered to give thanks for the bounty of the earth. The gardens were filled with flowers, herbs, and plants that had religious significance. These weren't just decorative additions. They were integral to the rituals performed in the city. Flowers, particularly marigolds, were used to decorate the temples, and the scent of these blooms would have permeated the air during religious festivals. The flowers represented life, death, and rebirth, a cycle that was mirrored in the growth of the crops on the Chinampas. The entire process of planting, growing, and harvesting was imbued with meaning, connecting the Aztecs to the divine forces that they believed controlled the cycles of life. Even the layout of the Chinampas was symbolic. The way the gardens were constructed, floating in the water, with canals weaving between them, represented the balance of life and death, creation and destruction. The canals that separated the gardens could be seen as a representation of the underworld, while the gardens themselves symbolized the fertile earth, where life was nurtured and sustained. This duality was central to the Aztec worldview. Life and death, order and chaos, were constantly in balance, and the Chinampas were a physical manifestation of that belief. The religious significance of the Chinampas didn't stop at the crops they produced. The entire process of creating and maintaining the floating gardens was seen as an act of divine cooperation. The Aztecs believed that the gods had given them the knowledge to create these gardens, and in return, they offered the fruits of their labor back to the gods. The effort to keep the Chinampas in good condition was not seen as mere manual labor. It was viewed as a form of worship. In a sense, maintaining the floating gardens was a way of paying homage to the gods, an offering of time, skill, and effort to ensure that the cycle of life continued. Even the seasonal changes that affected the Chinampas had religious implications. The floods that occurred during the rainy season, while challenging, were also seen as a form of divine blessing. Water, to the Aztecs, was a sacred substance. It was life-giving and purifying. When the rains came, the Chinampas would flood, rejuvenating the soil and ensuring the next crop would thrive. The act of flooding the gardens was almost ritualistic, symbolizing the renewal of life. The water would wash over the soil, cleansing it and preparing it for the next harvest. The Aztecs understood the cycles of nature and used these natural rhythms as a way to maintain their spiritual and agricultural practices. The Chinampas also held a central place in the Aztec calendar, which was deeply tied to both religious and agricultural cycles. The Aztec year was divided into 18 months, each associated with a particular god and a specific type of crop. The planting and harvesting of crops in the Chinampas were directly tied to this calendar. As the seasons changed, so did the gods' influence on the crops that were grown. The Aztecs had an incredibly detailed understanding of the best times to plant and harvest different crops, and this knowledge was directly linked to their religious practices. The Chinampas were, in a sense, the physical representation of this calendar, a living, breathing testament to the Aztecs' understanding of the cosmic order. The importance of the Chinampas as sacred spaces also extended to their role in community life. The gardens weren't just for individual families. They were a communal resource. People worked together to maintain the gardens, share in the harvest, and participate in the religious ceremonies that revolved around the crops. The floating gardens were a reflection of the communal nature of Aztec society, where every member had a role to play in maintaining balance, both in the physical world and the spiritual world. As we think about the Chinampas, it's easy to get caught up in their practical aspects, their incredible agricultural output, their role in sustaining the population of Tenochtitlan, and their contributions to the economy and military strategy. But what makes these floating gardens truly remarkable is their profound connection to the Aztec worldview. These gardens were not just a technological feat. They were an expression of the Aztec understanding of the world, a world where nature, spirituality, and daily life were inseparable. The Chinampas were sacred, and they continue to be a symbol of the Aztecs' ingenuity, reverence for nature, and spiritual depth. Underscore as you paddle through the canals of Tenochtitlan. The bustling life of the city is all around you. The sound of water lapping at the sides of your canoe is punctuated by the chatter of merchants, the clink of goods being exchanged, and the rhythmic strokes of paddles cutting through the water. While the floating gardens, or Chinampas, were a marvel of agricultural engineering, their impact wasn't just confined to the realm of farming. These floating gardens had far-reaching economic implications, influencing the entire structure of the Aztec economy and the way the city of Tenochtitlan functioned as a whole. Tenochtitlan was, after all, one of the most sophisticated cities of its time, and the floating gardens were at the center of that sophistication. The Chinampas made it possible for the Aztecs to produce enough food to sustain a large and growing population. This was no small feat. Historians believe that at its peak, Tenochtitlan had a population of over 200,000 people. To support such a dense population, the city had to be incredibly efficient in its agricultural production. The Chinampas allowed for a consistent and reliable food supply, ensuring that people could not only survive but thrive. But the economic impact of the Chinampas didn't stop at food production. The surplus food they produced created the foundation for an economy built on trade. Since the Chinampas were capable of growing a wide variety of crops, corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, and more, Tenochtitlan became a major hub for trade in Mesoamerica. The abundance of food allowed the Aztecs to engage in long-distance trade with neighboring regions, exchanging agricultural products for goods like cotton, jade, and obsidian. The floating gardens were, in many ways, the engine that powered this trade economy. The ability to produce a surplus of food also meant that the Aztecs could feed their military, enabling them to maintain a strong and powerful army. The Chinampas were not just feeding the civilians, they were feeding the warriors, who were crucial to maintaining the power and expansion of the Aztec Empire. The fact that the Chinampas could produce enough food to support both the population and the military was a major factor in the success of the Aztec state. It's almost as if the Aztecs had created their own self-sustaining system, where agriculture, trade, and military power were all interconnected and supported each other. The economic model that the Chinampas helped create was a circular one. The surplus food produced by the gardens was traded for luxury goods, which in turn were traded within the city, fueling the local economy. Markets sprang up along the canals, where merchants would sell everything from food to textiles to jewelry. These markets were vital to the economic life of Tenochtitlan, and the Chinampas were at the heart of it all. As you pass through one of these markets in your mind's eye, imagine the array of goods for sale. Fresh vegetables, herbs, fruits, fish, and even cacao, the currency of the Aztecs. The markets were vibrant, and they were directly tied to the productivity of the floating gardens. Now, let's take a moment to think about the technological innovation that made all of this possible. The Aztecs didn't just rely on simple farming techniques. They understood the intricacies of the environment and adapted to it in ways that modern agricultural systems are still learning from today. The Chinampas allowed for year-round farming, which was a significant advantage in an environment where traditional farming methods often had to rely on seasonal rains. By creating stable, floating plots, the Aztecs were able to grow crops even during dry seasons, ensuring a constant food supply. This was not only crucial for the survival of the population, but also for the economic stability of the city. It's also worth noting that the Chinampas were highly labor-intensive. While this might sound like a disadvantage, it was actually an asset in an economy that relied heavily on human labor. The Chinampas were worked by a large number of people, many of whom were employed specifically to tend the gardens. This created jobs, provided a steady income for those working on the gardens, and contributed to the overall economy of Tenochtitlan. The city was a bustling economic engine, with workers, merchants, soldiers, and priests all playing their part in ensuring that the system continued to function. Every element of the economy, agriculture, trade, military, and labor, was interdependent and supported by the floating gardens. But as we take a step back and look at the Chinampas in a broader economic context, it becomes clear that they were more than just a tool for survival. They were the foundation of the Aztec economic system. The success of Tenochtitlan was built on the ability to produce enough food to support a thriving city and empire. The Chinampas made this possible by ensuring that the Aztecs could produce a surplus, trade that surplus, and use it to sustain their people, their military, and their political power. And let's not forget about the ecological impact. The Chinampas were, in many ways, an environmentally sustainable solution to the problem of limited agricultural land. By using the water of Lake Texcoco as both a source of irrigation and a foundation for farming, the Aztecs were able to maximize their use of available resources. The system of crop rotation, along with the constant addition of nutrients from the lake sediment, kept the soil fertile and productive. In a time when many societies were struggling with soil depletion, the Aztecs had created a farming system that could endure for generations. The floating gardens also helped maintain the environmental balance of the region. While the city of Tenochtitlan was expanding rapidly, the Chinampas allowed the Aztecs to continue producing food without overtaxing the surrounding landscape. By farming on the water, they minimized the need for deforestation and other destructive practices. The system was a model of environmental stewardship, ensuring that the land and water were used sustainably. In a sense, the Aztecs were ahead of their time, creating an agricultural system that worked in harmony with the environment, something many modern societies are still striving to achieve today. However, as with all great systems, the Chinampas faced their own challenges. The expansion of Tenochtitlan and the growing demands of the empire put pressure on the floating gardens. Over time, the balance that the Aztecs had struck between the land, water, and agriculture became more difficult to maintain. As the city grew and the demands of the military and trade increased, the resources available to maintain the Chinampas became strained. The legacy of the Chinampas is a testament to both the brilliance and the limitations of Aztec society. Despite their ingenuity, they could not escape the pressures of expansion and conquest that would eventually bring their civilization to an end. As the sun begins to set over the waters of Lake Texcoco, the calm serenity of the floating gardens hides a deeper story, one of inevitable change, and not for the better. The Chinampas, once the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan, would eventually face challenges that no amount of ingenuity or agricultural prowess could overcome. The city, once a marvel of engineering and culture, began to shift. The very system that had allowed it to flourish, the floating gardens, was eventually tested beyond its limits. In this section, we look at the decline of the Chinampas and how their fall mirrored the ultimate demise of the Aztec capital. The first signs of trouble began with the growing pressures on the empire. As Tenochtitlan expanded, its needs grew exponentially. The city, once designed to exist in harmony with its environment, now began to strain against the very limits that had made it so successful. The demand for food, trade, and military resources increased, and with it, the pressure on the floating gardens. Though the Chinampas had been designed to be resilient and productive, the sheer scale of the city's growth meant that the gardens could no longer keep up with the population's needs. What had once been a sustainable system was beginning to be stretched too thin. The most immediate problem came from the physical limitations of the Chinampas themselves. While these floating gardens were built to withstand changing water levels, extreme flooding, and other natural forces, the expansion of the city placed greater strain on the canals and water systems. The once carefully maintained waterways, which had been designed to regulate water levels and allow for proper drainage, became increasingly clogged. Over time, the delicate balance that the Aztecs had worked so hard to achieve began to falter. Floods, which had once been a natural part of the system's rhythm, became increasingly destructive, submerging crops and damaging the delicate infrastructure of the Chinampas. Adding to this strain was the growing threat of foreign invaders. As the Aztec Empire expanded, it made more enemies. The Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, began to tighten their grip on Mesoamerica, and Tenochtitlan found itself at the center of a siege. As the Spanish forces closed in, the Aztecs' agricultural systems, including the Chinampas, were hit hard. The canals that had once served as both transportation routes and defensive barriers were now obstacles for both the Aztecs and their enemies. The once thriving markets along the canals became deserted, and the gardens that had fed an empire fell into disrepair. In the chaos of battle and siege, the Chinampas couldn't survive. Crops were destroyed, irrigation systems collapsed, and the food supply dwindled. It wasn't just military conflict that caused the decline of the Chinampas. The Spanish introduced new farming practices along with European diseases that decimated the indigenous population. With the Aztec people weakened by disease and warfare, there was no one left to tend the floating gardens. The city itself, once a bustling hub of trade and culture, became a battleground. The Chinampas, once thriving with life, became abandoned, the crops rotting on their once fertile plots. What had been a sophisticated agricultural system designed to support an empire was now a casualty of war. As the Spanish took control of Tenochtitlan, the Chinampas began to fade into memory. The canals, once filled with life and commerce, were drained, and much of the infrastructure that had supported the floating gardens was destroyed. Over time, the lakes were filled in to make room for European-style buildings, and the floating gardens were forgotten, their legacy slipping into history. The very system that had allowed the Aztecs to grow into one of the most powerful empires of the Americas was erased in the wake of conquest. Yet, even as the Chinampas faded, their story did not end entirely. Over time, small patches of these floating gardens would be revived, primarily by indigenous communities around Mexico City. Today, in the Xochimilco area of Mexico City, you can still find remnants of the ancient Chinampas, where local farmers continue to grow crops on these ancient floating gardens. Though the system was irreparably damaged during the Spanish conquest, the enduring legacy of the Chinampas remains. They are a reminder of the Aztecs' brilliance in harnessing their environment and their ability to innovate in ways that were far ahead of their time. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just the fall of a city. It was the fall of an entire way of life. The destruction of the Chinampas was a reflection of the larger forces that led to the collapse of the Aztec Empire. The Chinampas were both the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan and its ultimate casualty. As the Spanish arrived, the brilliant agricultural systems that had supported the city for centuries could not survive the onslaught of foreign conquest, disease, and internal strife. But the memory of the Chinampas endures a testament to the Aztecs' ability to adapt and thrive in a challenging environment. What's fascinating about the Chinampas is how they symbolize not just the resilience of the Aztecs, but also their understanding of the delicate balance between nature, culture, and survival. The gardens weren't just about food. They were about creating harmony between the human and natural worlds, between the spiritual and the earthly. The destruction of the Chinampas marked the end of an era, but their legacy lives on in the agricultural systems that continue to thrive in Mexico today. The floating gardens of Tenochtitlan are a reminder that sometimes, even the most advanced systems could be undone by forces beyond our control, but their influence can persist in surprising ways, long after they are gone. As we step away from the ruins of Tenochtitlan and move through the layers of history, the legacy of the Chinampas becomes more than just a memory of what once was. Despite the devastation brought by the Spanish conquest, the ingenuity of the floating gardens has left an indelible mark on both the history of Mexico and the world's agricultural practices. Though the grandeur of the Aztec capital has long since crumbled, the Chinampas, in their most modern form, still exist, quietly thriving in the heart of Mexico City. As you imagine the world today, take a moment to picture these ancient floating gardens not as relics of the past, but as living pieces of history, still standing in the face of time. The story of the Chinampas didn't end with the fall of Tenochtitlan. In fact, in the centuries following the conquest, these remarkable agricultural systems have seen a quiet resurgence. While much of the infrastructure of Tenochtitlan was destroyed, a few pockets of Chinampas remained, particularly in the Xochimilco area of what is now Mexico City. This area, once the heart of the Aztec floating gardens, still contains remnants of the ancient Chinampas, and they're actively used today by local farmers to grow everything from flowers to vegetables. In a world where modern agriculture has become synonymous with industrial farming, the survival of the Chinampas in their original form is a testament to the durability of Aztec innovation. What's truly fascinating is how the revival of the Chinampas has brought both historical and ecological benefits. Modern farmers in Xochimilco continue to use traditional methods to cultivate crops on these floating gardens, which are still carefully constructed using the same reed mats and dredged lakebed soil that the Aztecs used. These gardens, despite their ancient origins, have proven to be a sustainable agricultural system that thrives without the need for heavy machinery or chemical fertilizers. The soil in the Chinampas is naturally enriched by the sediment from the lake, creating an environment that is perfect for growing crops. The system allows for organic farming, free from pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, and produces crops that are fresher and healthier than many modern alternatives. The environmental benefits of the Chinampas are also worth noting. In an era of climate change and ecological disruption, the Chinampas represent a form of agriculture that works in harmony with nature. These floating gardens help prevent erosion, maintain biodiversity, and reduce the need for irrigation systems that deplete natural water resources. The Chinampas are naturally irrigated by the lake water, which means they don't require the extensive water use seen in conventional agriculture. This has led to their designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing their unique ecological and cultural value. The fact that the Chinampas have endured and are still in use today is a testament to the brilliance of Aztec agricultural systems, as well as the resilience of local communities who have continued to preserve this tradition. But the Chinampas are more than just a sustainable farming system. They are also a symbol of the connection between past and present. As you think about the Chinampas in the modern world, you can't help but realize how much of our agricultural past has been forgotten or neglected. In many ways, the Chinampas are a bridge between ancient practices and contemporary concerns about food security, environmental sustainability, and ecological balance. The ability of the Chinampas to continue thriving in the modern world shows how ancient knowledge can offer solutions to modern problems. The revival of the Chinampas also carries a deep cultural significance. For the people living in the Xochimilco area today, the Chinampas are more than just a source of income. They're a link to their heritage. The techniques used to build and maintain the gardens are passed down through generations, preserving a living connection to the Aztec past. The knowledge of how to cultivate the floating gardens is deeply embedded in the culture of the region, and the community continues to value and protect this heritage. It's not just about farming. It's about keeping a centuries-old tradition alive and ensuring that future generations can benefit from it. And let's not overlook the significance of the Chinampas to the people of Mexico City as a whole. The Xochimilco area, with its canals and floating gardens, is one of the last remaining vestiges of the ancient Aztec city. It's a place where the past and present coexist, and it offers a glimpse into what life might have been like in the heart of Tenochtitlan. For visitors to Mexico City, taking a boat ride through the canals of Xochimilco is not just a tourist activity. It's a chance to connect with the past, to float on the same waters where the Aztecs once navigated, and to see the Chinampas in action. It's a reminder that the ingenuity of the Aztecs is still alive today, woven into the fabric of modern Mexican life. The Chinampas also serve as a reminder of the enduring power of indigenous knowledge. Despite centuries of colonization, the Chinampas have survived, largely intact, as a symbol of indigenous resilience and innovation. They stand as a defiant reminder of the wisdom and ingenuity of the pre-Columbian world, a world that existed long before the modern agricultural systems we rely on today. As we face challenges like climate change, food insecurity, and environmental degradation, it's worth looking to the past for inspiration. The Chinampas show us that sometimes the answers to our most pressing problems lie in the wisdom of ancient traditions. So, as we look to the future, we can't help but be inspired by the legacy of the Chinampas. What began as a tool for survival in a harsh environment has endured for centuries, adapting to changing times and continuing to offer solutions to the challenges of modern agriculture. The floating gardens of the Aztecs, once a symbol of the city's greatness, now serve as a model for sustainable farming and a beacon of hope for the future. As we continue our journey through time, we reach a turning point where the Chinampas, once abandoned and forgotten after the fall of Tenochtitlan, begin to emerge from the shadows of history, as if waking from a long sleep. These floating gardens, which were at the heart of the Aztec Empire's agricultural brilliance, have experienced a quiet but powerful revival in modern times. What once seemed like a lost piece of the past has come to life again, offering insights into the ancient practices that help sustain one of the greatest civilizations of the Americas. Today, the Chinampas are more than just a relic. They are a living, breathing part of the modern landscape. The rebirth of the Chinampas began in the mid-20th century as a renewed interest in preserving indigenous agricultural techniques and sustainable farming methods took hold. As modern agriculture spread throughout the world, bringing with it industrial farming practices, many people began to question the environmental and ecological impact of such systems. The rise of the environmental movement in the 1960s and 1970s, coupled with growing concerns over climate change, soil depletion, and water scarcity, led to a resurgence of interest in the Chinampas as a sustainable agricultural model. Located in the Xochimilco area of Mexico City, once the heart of the Aztec capital, these ancient floating gardens have been carefully preserved and even revived by local farmers and activists. The Xochimilco region, with its complex system of canals, is one of the few places in the world where you can still see the Chinampas in use today. These gardens, which have endured through centuries of environmental change, economic upheaval, and political shifts, are now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, ensuring that they are protected for future generations. The revival of the Chinampas is more than just about restoring an ancient farming technique. It's about returning to a way of life that is deeply connected to the land and water. In a world where modern agriculture often relies on pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, and large-scale monocultures, the Chinampas offer a refreshing alternative. By cultivating crops on floating beds of nutrient-rich soil, farmers in the Xochimilco region are able to grow a variety of crops without the need for chemical inputs or excessive irrigation. The natural filtration provided by the water not only nourishes the plants, but also helps to maintain the ecological balance of the area. It's a sustainable system that has stood the test of time and provides valuable lessons for how we can farm in harmony with nature. But the Chinampas revival isn't just about agriculture. It's about community. The people of Xochimilco, many of whom are descendants of the original inhabitants, have long recognized the importance of the Chinampas to their cultural heritage. These gardens are not just a source of food. They're a symbol of the resilience and ingenuity of the Aztec people. By returning to the practices of their ancestors, the people of Xochimilco are preserving a way of life that has been passed down through generations. Local farmers and families work together to maintain the Chinampas, sharing knowledge and techniques that have been honed over centuries. It's a model of communal farming that emphasizes cooperation over competition and sustainability over exploitation. The role of the Chinampas in the local economy is also vital. The crops grown on these floating gardens are sold in local markets, where they fetch a premium due to their organic and sustainable nature. You'll find everything from flowers to vegetables, and even ornamental plants, thriving on these floating plots. The unique method of farming not only supports local communities, but also helps to protect the environment. The Chinampas are a model for how we can rethink modern agriculture, moving away from destructive practices toward more sustainable and ecologically friendly methods. Moreover, the revival of the Chinampas has become a symbol of cultural pride for the people of Xochimilco and for Mexico as a whole. These gardens, once considered a forgotten relic of the past, are now seen as a source of cultural identity and pride. As visitors come from all over the world to see the Chinampas and learn about their history, they are reminded of the Aztecs' incredible ingenuity and the lasting legacy of their agricultural practices. The Chinampas have become a symbol of indigenous knowledge, reminding us that the solutions to many of today's environmental challenges may lie in the traditions of the past. But the revival of the Chinampas has not been without its challenges. As the population of Mexico City continues to grow, urban sprawl threatens the delicate ecosystem of Xochimilco. The canals, once the lifeblood of the floating gardens, are now being encroached upon by development. Pollution from the city also poses a significant threat to the health of the Chinampas and the crops they produce. In response, local farmers, environmentalists, and government agencies have worked together to protect the region. Measures have been taken to clean the canals, reduce pollution, and promote sustainable farming practices. The revival of the Chinampas has become a symbol of the fight to preserve both cultural heritage and environmental sustainability in the face of modern challenges. Even with these challenges, the success of the Chinampas revival is a hopeful story, one of resilience, innovation, and community. The lessons learned from the Chinampas offer valuable insights into how we can approach agriculture in a way that is both sustainable and connected to the land. As the world faces increasing environmental pressures, the Chinampas offer a blueprint for how we can farm with respect for nature, rather than against it. These floating gardens show us that sometimes the solutions to modern problems can be found by looking to the past. In a way, the Chinampas have come full circle. What was once a symbol of the Aztecs' mastery over nature has become a symbol of hope for a more sustainable future. The revival of these ancient gardens serves as a reminder that while history can be lost, it can also be rediscovered and used to guide us toward a better future. The Chinampas are not just a piece of the past. They're a living legacy that continues to shape the present and the future. As we continue our journey through the history and revival of the Chinampas, we come to an essential part of their legacy, their role in ecological conservation. While the Chinampas are often celebrated for their ingenuity in providing food and their importance to Aztec culture, they're also an extraordinary example of sustainable farming that works in harmony with the environment. Today, as the world grapples with climate change, deforestation, and soil depletion, the Chinampas offer a blueprint for ecological conservation that is as relevant today as it was when they were first created. In the Xochimilco region of Mexico City, where the Chinampas continue to thrive, they provide a crucial ecological function that extends far beyond food production. The floating gardens are not just farms, they're ecosystems in themselves. The system of Chinampas works like a natural filtration system, purifying the water and providing a habitat for various species of fish, birds, and other wildlife. The canals that weave through the floating gardens create a micro-ecosystem where plants, animals, and water interact in a way that supports biodiversity and enhances the health of the region's waterways. The key to the ecological success of the Chinampas lies in their design. The gardens are built on the water using reed mats, and the soil in these gardens is constantly replenished by nutrients from the lake sediment. This makes the Chinampas self-sustaining, requiring minimal external inputs. Unlike modern farming, which often depletes the soil and requires artificial fertilizers, the Chinampas benefit from the natural cycle of renewal. The water flowing through the canals acts as a natural irrigation system, reducing the need for additional water sources and minimizing the use of fresh water. The process of dredging the lake bed for soil creates a constant flow of nutrients into the Chinampas, ensuring that the soil remains fertile and productive. This natural irrigation system has significant ecological benefits. The canals help to maintain the water level in the region, preventing flooding and ensuring that the surrounding ecosystems stay balanced. In addition, the canals serve as a form of water management that prevents soil erosion, which is a common problem in many modern farming systems. In places where traditional farming techniques have caused environmental degradation, the Chinampas represent a more sustainable way of farming that works with nature rather than against it. The floating gardens are also a sanctuary for wildlife. The canals and Chinampas create a rich environment where fish, amphibians, and insects can thrive. Species such as the axolotl, a type of salamander native to the region, have made their home in the canals of Xochimilco, relying on the clean water and the plants that grow in the Chinampas. These gardens provide a critical habitat for species that are threatened by urbanization and pollution. The biodiversity supported by the Chinampas is a testament to the ecological wisdom of the Aztecs, who built their cities and agriculture systems in such a way that they didn't just use the environment, but they actively contributed to maintaining it. But the role of the Chinampas in ecological conservation isn't just about what's happening in the canals. The revival of these floating gardens has become a key part of the broader movement to protect the environment in Mexico. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the need to preserve the region's traditional agricultural systems in order to maintain both the cultural heritage and the natural ecosystems of the area. Local communities, environmental activists, and government organizations are working together to ensure that the Chinampas continue to play a role in ecological conservation. These efforts include cleaning and preserving the canals, promoting sustainable farming practices, and ensuring that the Chinampas remain a viable farming method for future generations. Moreover, the Chinampas have become an important part of the conversation around climate change. In an era where modern farming is contributing to climate change through practices like deforestation, soil degradation, and excessive water use, the Chinampas offer an alternative model. They show us that it is possible to produce food sustainably, using techniques that are environmentally friendly and adaptable to the challenges of a changing climate. By restoring the Chinampas and promoting them as a model for sustainable agriculture, we are not just preserving a piece of history. We are helping to shape a more sustainable future for farming. One of the key lessons of the Chinampas is their ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions. For example, the Aztecs originally developed the Chinampas in response to the unique challenges of growing crops in a lake environment. Today, the floating gardens are being used to adapt to the challenges of urbanization and climate change. As the city of Mexico continues to grow, the Chinampas provide a way to produce food within the urban landscape without contributing to the depletion of natural resources. They are a form of urban agriculture that offers a sustainable solution to feeding the growing population while reducing the environmental impact of large-scale industrial farming. In addition to their role in farming, the Chinampas are also valuable for tourism and education. People from around the world visit Xochimilco to see the Chinampas in action, and many are learning about the importance of sustainable farming and ecological conservation. The Chinampas provide a living example of how we can work with nature to create systems that are both productive and environmentally responsible. The opportunity to see these ancient gardens in action is a powerful reminder of the wisdom that can be found in traditional farming systems, and it encourages visitors to think more deeply about the environmental impact of their own food choices. It's clear that the Chinampas are more than just a relic of the past. They are an essential part of the future. Their ability to combine ecological conservation, sustainable agriculture, and cultural heritage makes them an invaluable resource in the fight to preserve our planet. In a world where modern farming practices are contributing to environmental degradation, the Chinampas show us that there is another way, a way that works with nature rather than against it. The future of agriculture, it seems, may lie not in the technologies of tomorrow, but in the ancient wisdom of the past. As we move forward in our exploration of the Chinampas, we begin to see how these remarkable floating gardens are not just symbols of agricultural brilliance, but also lasting evidence of Aztec ingenuity. The story of the Chinampas is not merely a tale of ancient farming techniques. It is a profound narrative of how the Aztecs used their deep knowledge of the environment to create an agricultural system that allowed them to build a thriving city on an island in the middle of a lake. As we look at the legacy of the Chinampas today, it's clear that these gardens are more than just a relic of the past. They are a living reminder of the Aztecs' incredible ability to innovate and adapt. To understand the depth of Aztec innovation, we need to look at how the Chinampas fit into the broader context of their society. The Aztecs were not just farmers. They were engineers, architects, and urban planners. Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, was a city unlike any other. Built on a series of islands in Lake Texcoco, the city was designed with intricate canals, causeways, and floating gardens to ensure that it could support a large and growing population. The Chinampas were not an afterthought. They were a key component of the city's design. They were a deliberate solution to the challenges of growing food in an environment where arable land was limited, and they reflect the Aztecs' mastery over their environment. The Aztecs had an extraordinary understanding of ecology, water management, and resource utilization. They didn't just build a city on water. They engineered a system that used the water itself to sustain life. The Chinampas were a perfect example of this ingenuity. By floating gardens on the surface of the lake, the Aztecs were able to turn what could have been a disadvantage, living in a location with limited land, into an advantage. They made use of every square inch of available space, creating a sustainable system that provided food, water, and even a defense mechanism for the city. It was a system that worked with nature rather than against it, and it allowed the Aztecs to thrive in a harsh environment. But the Aztecs' innovation didn't stop at agriculture. They were also pioneers in the fields of architecture and urban planning. Tenochtitlan, with its canals and floating gardens, was a marvel of urban design. The city was laid out in a grid pattern, with causeways that connected the islands to the mainland and allowed for easy transportation. The canals were not just for irrigation. They were highways for boats, enabling goods and people to move freely through the city. The Chinampas fit seamlessly into this design, serving as both agricultural plots and vital infrastructure. The Aztecs knew that in order to build a thriving city, they needed to create systems that worked in harmony with each other. The Chinampas were a key part of this harmonious system, providing food, supporting trade, and even contributing to the city's defense. The ingenuity of the Chinampas also lay in their sustainability. Unlike modern industrial farming systems, which deplete the soil and require massive amounts of water and chemicals, the Chinampas were self-sustaining. The Aztecs used the water of Lake Texcoco to irrigate their crops, and they used the sediment from the lake to enrich the soil. The result was a fertile, productive system that required minimal external inputs. In fact, the Chinampas were a perfect example of a circular agricultural system. What the gardens produced was not only food for the people of Tenochtitlan, but also the very materials needed to maintain the system itself. The process of dredging the lake bed for soil replenished the lake's ecosystem, creating a system that was in constant balance. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Chinampas was how they reflected the Aztecs' deep understanding of their environment. They didn't just rely on intuition. They used careful observation and experimentation to create a system that worked. They understood how water, soil, and plant life interacted, and they used this knowledge to create a farming system that could withstand the challenges of their environment. The Chinampas were an engineering marvel that combined practical knowledge with spiritual significance. They were not just a means of survival. They were a reflection of the Aztecs' worldview, where nature, religion, and human ingenuity were all intertwined. Today, as we look back on the Chinampas, we can see how they continue to inspire modern agricultural practices. The revival of the Chinampas in places like Xochimilco is a testament to the lasting impact of Aztec innovation. In a world that increasingly faces environmental challenges, the Chinampas offer a glimpse into a way of farming that is sustainable, efficient, and in harmony with the environment. The lessons learned from the Chinampas, from their sustainable use of water to their emphasis on community farming, are more relevant today than ever before. The Aztecs, with their deep understanding of nature, were not just farmers. They were environmental stewards who created a system that could support their civilization for centuries. And the legacy of the Chinampas is more than just agricultural. They are a reminder of the incredible potential of human innovation when we work with, rather than against, nature. The Aztecs didn't just survive in their environment. They thrived, creating a system that allowed their civilization to flourish. The Chinampas are a testament to the power of human creativity and the importance of sustainable practices. As the world faces increasing environmental challenges, we can look to the Chinampas as a model for how we can balance human needs with the health of the planet. The Aztecs may have fallen, but their innovation lives on, offering valuable lessons for future generations. As we reach the final part of our journey through the story of the Chinampas, we come full circle to the lasting influence these remarkable floating gardens have had, not just on the Aztec civilization, but on modern agriculture, culture, and even our understanding of sustainability. The legacy of the Chinampas is not confined to the distant past. It continues to resonate in the world today, reminding us of the enduring wisdom and innovation of the Aztec people. While the city of Tenochtitlan may have fallen, the principles behind the Chinampas still guide us in shaping the future of sustainable farming and ecological conservation. The Chinampas were one of the most advanced agricultural systems of their time, and their influence is felt in many parts of the world today. As urbanization and industrialization continue to reshape our landscapes, the Chinampas offer a powerful lesson that we can use the land and water around us to create self-sustaining, environmentally friendly systems. In an era where climate change, water scarcity, and soil degradation threaten global food security, the Chinampas serve as a model for how we can produce food without compromising the health of our ecosystems. The revival of these gardens, particularly in the Xochimilco area of Mexico City, demonstrates the relevance of Aztec agricultural practices in modern times. Through the careful cultivation of floating gardens, local farmers continue to provide fresh, organic produce while preserving the delicate balance between nature and human intervention. One of the most significant contributions of the Chinampas to modern agriculture is their ability to produce food in urban environments. In cities around the world, land for farming is becoming increasingly scarce, and traditional agricultural practices are often unsustainable due to water and land use issues. The Chinampas, however, offer a solution to these problems. By utilizing water to grow crops, rather than relying solely on traditional soil-based farming, they allow urban areas to produce food without the need for extensive land or water resources. This makes the Chinampas a powerful tool for urban farming, offering a sustainable way to feed growing populations without compromising the environment. In addition to their agricultural value, the Chinampas are also a symbol of cultural resilience. The people of Xochimilco, many of whom are descendants of the original inhabitants of Tenochtitlan, continue to honor the traditions of their ancestors by maintaining these floating gardens. The revival of the Chinampas is not just about preserving a farming technique. It's about preserving a way of life, a cultural connection to the land, and a deep respect for the environment. For the people of Xochimilco, the Chinampas are a reminder of their heritage, and the work of tending these gardens is a form of cultural continuity that connects them to their ancestors. The Chinampas also play a key role in preserving biodiversity. In an era where monoculture farming is the norm, the Chinampas offer a way to grow a variety of crops in a small area, increasing biodiversity and reducing the need for harmful pesticides and fertilizers. This method of polyculture farming, where different plants grow together and support one another, is far more resilient to pests and diseases than monoculture systems. By maintaining the diverse ecosystems within the Chinampas, the Aztecs created a farming system that was not only sustainable but also protective of the environment. Beyond agriculture, the Chinampas have a profound impact on the cultural landscape of Mexico. The Xochimilco region, with its network of canals and floating gardens, is one of the last remaining examples of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican agricultural practices. The area has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, attracting tourists from around the world who come to experience the unique combination of history, culture, and nature. As visitors glide through the canals on brightly painted trigeneras, boats, they're not only enjoying the beauty of the area, but also learning about the rich history of the Chinampas and the ingenuity of the Aztec people. The preservation of the Chinampas allows future generations to understand and appreciate the relationship between the Aztecs and their environment, ensuring that this ancient knowledge is not lost to time. The story of the Chinampas is also a story of resilience. The Aztecs built their floating gardens to survive and thrive in a challenging environment. Today, as we face environmental crises such as deforestation, water scarcity, and the degradation of soil, we can draw inspiration from the Chinampas as a symbol of human ingenuity in the face of adversity. In a world where modern farming practices are often at odds with the natural environment, the Chinampas offer a sustainable solution that works in harmony with nature. They show us that we can feed the world without destroying the planet, a lesson that the Aztecs understood long before we did. What makes the Chinampas truly remarkable is their ability to transcend time. From the heights of the Aztec Empire to the challenges of the modern world, these floating gardens have continued to adapt, survive, and thrive. They are a testament to the resourcefulness of the Aztecs and a reminder that the knowledge of the past can provide us with the tools to build a more sustainable future. The Chinampas are more than just an agricultural system. They are a living connection between the ancient and the modern, a symbol of how innovation, culture, and nature can come together to create something truly extraordinary. As we stand here today, looking back at the incredible legacy of the Chinampas, we are reminded of the profound impact that one agricultural system can have on the world. The Chinampas are not just a piece of history. They are a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit and our ability to adapt, innovate, and live in harmony with the natural world. The Aztecs may have fallen, but the Chinampas remain, continuing to nourish both the people and the land. Their legacy is one of hope, sustainability, and the enduring power of human ingenuity. Now, as we close this chapter in the story of the Chinampas, we can't help but feel a sense of awe at how a system created centuries ago continues to shape our world today. The floating gardens of the Aztecs are no longer just a part of history. They're a living, breathing part of our future. End of script. Sweet dreams.